everyone, welcome back to our channel. This is the second of our videos in which we are dealing with the history of the Jewish people from the period of Alexander the Great all the way through up until the end of the First Jewish-Roman War. In our first video, we talked about a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, and he was the ruler of Syria at the time. And we saw how he made an attempt to invade and annex Egypt, where he was met by a Roman force, which challenged him to become aware that if he was to attack Egypt, then he would have to fight against Rome as well. And because he knew that his force was not able to conquer the might of Rome, he backed down and retreated in humiliation. And so now he had to retreat. He had to take his troops and is heading back home to Syria in embarrassment and shame. And at this point, he's suffering from something the psychiatrists call displacement. And displacement is when someone does something to you, and because you're not able to respond to that person, you respond to someone else. So for example, if you're at work and your boss shouts at you, you can't shout back at your boss, so you go home and shout at your wife or children. That's displacement, and that's what Antiochus is doing. Or what some people say is that, you know, your boss shouts at you, you go home and you kick the cat. Well, Antiochus is in the mood to kick a cat, and he's looking for a cat to kick. So meanwhile, in Jerusalem, things are in a bit of turmoil, and they have been for a while. The Jews not only are very upset at having to be under the oppression of the rule of Antiochus and his Syrian people, but there are also some internal conflicts going on between the Jews themselves. There were two factions of Jews being formed at this time, and these two factions were constantly at odds with each other, each one seeking to get supremacy over the other by being the one that chose the high priest. On the one hand, you had what are called the Hellenistic Jews. These are the Jews that believe that, hey, you know, we're here under the Greek influence, and what we need to do is to make our religion more up to date. We need to bring our religion into the modern era and incorporate some of the Greek teachings and the Greek thinking into our religion, so that we can be more hip, you know, more modern, more up to date, and not stick to the old traditions of our fathers and our forefathers. And so they wanted to change the Jewish tradition to make it more modern, as it were, and more in line with the Greek teachings. This group was led by a man called Jason. That probably wasn't his real name. Some people say his name was actually Joshua, but because he wanted to sound Greek and not Jewish, he changed his name to Jason. Anyway, he was a priest, and he led that group which was seeking to become more Hellenistic or more Greek in Jewish practice. On the other hand, we had a priest called Onias, and Onias was the leader of the more traditional sect of the Jews. And of course, their viewers know we have to maintain our traditions, we have to keep the purity of our Jewish teachings, and not allow ourselves to be influenced by the Greek culture and the Greek teachings. And these two factions were, as I said, at odds with each other, each one trying to dominate the other, and the one that would dominate, of course, was the one that appointed the high priest. At one point, Jason himself went to Antiochus and petitioned Antiochus that he should make him, Jason, the high priest, and he promised Antiochus all kinds of wonderful taxes and so on if he did so. And Antiochus agreed, and he made Jason the high priest. Of course, Onias and his followers were very upset by this. But Jason didn't last very long as high priest, because another guy came up called Menelaus, and that also probably wasn't his real name, but he also went to Antiochus and said, make me the high priest, and I will give you even more money than Jason promised you. And of course, Antiochus said, sure, go ahead, and he made Menelaus the high priest. So this really upset all the Jews, because first of all, Menelaus was not of the priestly line at all. And secondly, Antiochus was interfering with their local religious practices and so on. And so they were very upset. and they, being under subjection to the Syrians, they weren't very happy at all. So there was these rumblings and these troubles happening in Jerusalem at this time. And so at the time we were discussing these matters, 168 BC, Antiochus has just left, turned from Egypt, and for some reason news reaches Jerusalem that Antiochus has been killed in Egypt. So yes, there was fake news even back then. And so they got word that Antiochus is dead. He has been killed. So the Jews they thought, whoa, this is a great thing. This would be a wonderful time for us to revolt, because the king is dead. And so a kind of a mini revolt erupts in Jerusalem. Now Antiochus, who of course is not dead, he gets word that the Jews are rebelling in Jerusalem. And as you know, he's upset already, he's already humiliated, he's already very angry, and now he has finally found his cat to kick. So he takes his men, diverts, and heads to Jerusalem, enters the city, and commences a series of persecutions against the Jews. His thinking was, hey, this is it. I'm finally going to take care of these miserable, pesky Jews once and for all. And the problem with these Jews is what he was probably saying. The problem with these Jews is their religion. And so I'm going to destroy their religion once and for all. And so he sets about doing that. He issues some rules. Says from now on he's going to put a ban on all male circumcision, which, as you know, is a practice of the Jews. He placed a ban on observing the Sabbath days and all other feast days. He placed a ban on having or maintaining any Jewish scriptures. He then turned his attention to the temple itself, and he immediately ceased all sacrifices to God in the temple. He put out the candlestick, the menorah, which was supposed to be burning continually. He extinguished that. And then he committed what was considered one of the most atrocious acts. He sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. And as you know, the pig is considered to be an unclean animal to the Jews. And so this would have totally desecrated the temple and the altar. It is said that he further forced the priests to eat the flesh of the pig or a pig. Again, Jews don't eat pork, and this would have been considered repulsive to the Jewish priests as well. But he did all this, of course, in his attempt to destroy the Jews and the Jewish religion. He then said to the Jews that from now on you will stop worshipping your God, and you will be worshipping the Greek god Zeus. So now your God is Zeus, and he is who you will worship. And to emphasize his point, he had a statue, an image of Zeus made and erected in the temple. This image is, I believe, what Daniel refers to in Daniel 11 as the abomination that causes desolate. What we refer to as the abomination of desolation, which is mentioned by Daniel in chapter 11 and chapter 12, and also by Jesus Christ himself in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. And so Antiochus is now engaging in a ruthless persecution of the Jews with a particular focus on their religion. He then decides to leave and returns to Syria, but he leaves in Jerusalem some of his soldiers and officials whose job it was to ensure that these rules that he implemented are maintained and kept and spread throughout all Judea. So now Antiochus has returned to Syria, and what is about to happen is a very important phase of Jewish history, which is known as the Maccabean Revolt. So remember, as we just said, Antiochus had imposed these very strict rules on the Jews, and these things were imposed on pain of death. if you kept the Sabbath, if you circumcised your son, if you had copies of scriptures, if you were found doing any of these things, you could be killed. So you can see the persecution that was now being experienced in Judea under Antiochus. But Antiochus decided that he wanted to make sure that his teachings or his rules are spread further beyond Jerusalem, like all through the other towns and so on in Judea. And so what they did, a practice was that they would get a group of officials and they would go from town to town and they would have these gatherings, which everyone would be invited to attend. And as part of these gatherings, they would have religious celebrations to their Greek gods. And you were expected to participate and join with them as they had these celebrations. So this they did. Eventually they came to a town called Modein, and they had one of these gatherings. And as part of the gatherings, they had their sacrifices and so on. Now, living in Modein at the time was an elderly priest by the name of Mattathias. Mattathias was a priest, and he had 5 sons, and he was one of the traditional Jews. And so the instruction came from the Syrian officials who were leading this gathering, this service together. And he instructed Mattathias to sacrifice a pig to one of the Greek gods. Of course, Mattathias refused and said he would not be doing that. In the same town, there were other priests, and there was one other priest who stood up and said, "No problem, I will do it. I will go ahead and sacrifice the pig to the Greek god." Now, this really enraged Mattathias, and as I said, he was an old man, but in some strange feat of superhuman strength, he took up a sword and he killed, first of all, the priest that was about to do the sacrifice, and he also killed the Syrian official. Not sure how he did that at his age, but he was quite strong apparently. And then the other Syrian officials who were there all fled for their lives in fear of Mattathias. So having done that, of course, he knew he couldn't stay around. So he took himself and his 5 sons, and they fled. And they literally fled to the hills. And this is the start of what is called the Maccabean Revolt. Because what they did, what Mattathias and his sons did at that point, and I'm sure there were a few who would have joined them at some point early on, they started a series of guerrilla-type attacks against the Syrians and against the Jews who were compromising, who were having idols. So they would attack the Jews and destroy their idols. They would attack the Syrians, and guerrilla style, hit and run. And this was very successful. Now, of course, as I said, Mattathias was a fairly old person, so he died very early up in the revolt. And his son, Judas, took over as the leader. Now, Judas wasn't the eldest son. In fact, he was like the middle son. But somehow they seemed to recognize in him that he was the man for the job. Because Judas then led a series of highly successful and effective guerrilla-type warfare against the Syrians. Very, very brilliant. He would carry out attacks which would, using a small number of people, attack a large body of the Syrians and cause great destruction. And just hit and run. A number of very brilliant attacks, brilliant moves he made, and caused great harm, of course, and great damage to the Syrians. And of course, as these things go, as he became more and more successful, more and more people joined him. And so his group became very, very strong and large, and they were able to do even more and cause even more problems for the Syrian. Judas was so successful that he gave him the nickname of the Hammer, meaning he was like a hammer against the Syrians. And the Jewish word for hammer is, of course, Maccabees, which is why he is called Judas Maccabee. Maccabee is not his real name, it's a nickname meaning the hammer. And so, very successful in his attempts to overthrow the Syrian leaders. And this continued for 3 years until 165 BC. And in 165 BC, Judas had become so powerful that he was actually able, along with his troops, to launch an attack against Jerusalem itself, which they did. And they were able to attack Jerusalem and drive the Syrians out of Jerusalem in a spectacular defeat. for the Syrians. And they were able to go in, reclaim the city, and even more so, they were able to go and reclaim the temple and cleanse the temple, drove the Syrians out, destroy the idols, cleanse the temple altogether, and they were able to do a rededication of the temple, having purified it. Of course, the Jewish word for dedication is Hanukkah, or Hanukkah, which is why the Jews celebrate Hanukkah every year as a remembrance of this dedication. And this dedication is also found as a feast attended by the Lord Jesus himself in John chapter 10. When it says here, he attended the feast of dedication, it was that feast that recognized this cleansing and rededication of the temple. So in 165 BC, the Syrians are driven out of Jerusalem, and once again the Jews are in charge, led by Judas Maccabee, and he is now appointed the high priest over Judah. Now, one of the interesting things that is mentioned concerning that dedication is an interesting story about the candlestick, the menorah. Because one of the things, as we mentioned, when Antiochus went into the temple, he would have put out the light of the menorah. So one of the things that they had to do was to rekindle that light. And the story goes that they didn't have enough of the consecrated oil in which to do so. So when they checked, they only had oil that would last for approximately 1 day. But they decided, well, we'll go ahead and do it anyway, and it'll burn for 1 day, and that's it. But the story goes that they did that, they lit the candle, and the candle burned not for 1 day, but for 8 consecutive days. And that's considered to be a miracle. There was no way that the light was supposed to last that long, but that's what we are told happened. And that's what's called the miracle of Hanukkah. And again, that's why Hanukkah is called the Festival of Lights, or the recognition of the lighting of the menorah, and that miracle of where the light lasted for 8 days. Alright, so now we've completed the Maccabean War, and we are now in 165 BC. And as I said, Judas is now high priest, and he is the person who will now be leading off something which would eventually become known as the Hasmonean Dynasty. And I just want to mention the Hasmonean Dynasty quickly before I close this video, because it's going to take us all the way down to the time of Herod and the time of the start of the New Testament. So I just want to add this piece just to bring us to that point, so we know what has been going on in Israel during that period, from 165 down to about 37 BC. So Judas is now high priest. He reigns for a few years and then he dies. His brother Jonathan follows him, and then he's followed by his other brother Simon. Now, I'm not going to be going through each of these people in any detail. I'm just giving you a very high level summary of some of the things that are important during this period. So Simon becomes the high priest, and in 142 BC, something very amazing happens. Under Simon, we call Simon Maccabee, under him, Israel declares itself to be an independent and sovereign territory. And they become recognized by those around them, by Syria and by Rome, as an independent territory. So now for the first time in hundreds of years, Israel is not subject to anyone else. They are now a totally autonomous, independent, self-governing nation run by Simon Maccabee as the king/high priest. And this is an amazing accomplishment. Unfortunately, it didn't last for very long, for reasons that we'll explain in this video and the next one. But now Israel is totally independent. And that's in 142 BC. Following Simon, there was one other notable king, a man called John Hyrcanus. He became king, and he did something that no other king of Israel had done before or after. Under him, the land that was governed by Israel expanded significantly. The area of Galilee, the area of Samaria, and particularly of interest, the area of Idumea, all came under the domain of the Jews, and under John Hyrcanus. But what he did that was quite unique is that when it came to Idumea, he not only conquered and brought them under the control of Israel, but he also forcefully converted them to Judaism. So he declared that from now on, all you Edomians are now Jewish. So you will now observe the Sabbath days and the other feast days. You will now follow all the dietary laws. You will now circumcise your sons, and so on. By law, by command, he forcibly made them Jewish. Now, of course, I don't think many people would have agreed with that. In fact, I think that most Jewish scholars and so on now look back on that period with a bit of embarrassment, because they don't think that's the way that the Jews were supposed to spread their religion, by forceful conversion. But John Hyrcanus did that, and he also expanded the territory owned significantly. He was followed by his two sons, Aristobulus and Alexander, and they also started fighting among themselves. They each married, well, they were married, both of them, at separate times, to a lady called Salome, or Salome, if you want to use that pronunciation. But they both died. One died. Aristobulus was married to Salome, and he died, and she married Alexander, and then he died, and she was left with her two young sons, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. And they were two young boys. So what was Salome to do? Well, she actually had to end up reigning as queen for a period of time. And so Israel had a queen for a brief period when Salome was reigning. And she died in 67 BC. And then her two sons, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, came up. One of them to succeed her and to become king. Now the problem was, and I hate to say this, but these two guys, I believe, have to be two of the biggest jokers in Jewish history, because they could not agree among themselves who would be king. And they fought amongst themselves. This guy wants to be king, this guy wants to be king, and they fought among themselves. But even worse, each of them separately and independently sent to Rome, and at this time the powerful person in Rome was Pompey, also called Pompey, eventually will be called Pompey the Great, or Pompey the Great. He was the leader, the most powerful person in Rome at the time, and each of them separately sent to Pompey and said, Pompey, come to Israel and kill my brother so that I can become king. They both did that separately. So of course Pompey comes down to Israel and he examines the situation and he says, okay, well, you guys can't decide who is going to reign. Well, I will decide who will reign. Me, Pompey. Well, Rome will reign. And so Rome takes over Israel. And that brings an end to the Hasmonean dynasty, and it brings an end to Israel's autonomy as an independent state. Because from this point onward, which was 63 BC, they are now under the domain of Rome. And that will remain so for a very, very long time, even until the 1st and 2nd century AD. So now Rome is ruling over Israel, and that was the situation, of course, when the Lord Jesus was born, when he came at that time. And so now, that brings an end to the Hasmonean dynasty. What happened after that is that Pompey appointed a man called Antipater as procurer of Judea, and by procurer it means that his job was essentially to procure taxes on behalf of Rome, and he did that. And then when Antipater was dying, before he died, he appointed his two sons to take over him. One son called Phasael, and the second son called Herod. And we'll talk about Herod a bit in the next video. He's a very interesting person. You know him as Herod the Great, or Herod the First, and he became a very influential person in the whole history of Israel. And so Phasael and Herod are now reigning. The Jews revolt again, as they always do. Eventually they get help from the Parthians, and they kill Phasael, or they depose him, and he's killed. Herod, on the other hand, flees from Israel, flees to Egypt, and then ultimately he flees to Rome. goes and stands before the Senate in Rome and says, guys, you guys got to help me, give me an army so I can go back and put these Jews in their place and take over as king of the Jews. And the Romans agreed, particularly a man called Marcus Antonius, also known as Mark Antony. You have heard of him. He was a very good friend of Herod, by the way. And so he agrees, gives Herod an army. Herod comes back to Judea in 40 BC and drives out the Parthians, and once again Rome takes over control of that area, and Herod is made king of the Jews in 37 BC. And that's where we'll stop this story for today. Next time, like I said on the next video, we'll pick up the story of Herod. Very, very colorful character, and we can learn a lot about him. Hopefully, we'll do so in the next video. As we close this video, friends, let me ask you something. Have you ever thought to yourself, I want to do something. I want to accomplish something, especially as a Christian, you want to accomplish something for God. Some ministry, some work that you think would be a good thing to do, and you really want to do it, but you stop and you think to yourself, yeah, this would be a good idea, but you know what, I can't do it because I just don't have enough. And that could be enough, several different things. Maybe you don't think you have enough money, if it's something that requires money to do. You may think you don't have enough knowledge. You may think you don't have enough experience. You don't have enough talent or ability. You don't have enough people to help you. You just don't have enough. And so you don't do anything because you think that you can't start because you don't have enough. Well, interestingly, in our story today, we have two examples of people who made a start, even though they may have thought to themselves that they didn't have enough. The first example was, of course, Mattathias, the priest in Modin. When he was confronted by the Syrians, he made a rebellion and started the revolt. He could have said, what's the sense of revolting? What's the sense of rebelling? I just don't have enough people to fight against the Syrians. And the Syrian army could number as much as 70,000 people at some points. And what do I have? That's myself and my 5 sons. I just don't have enough. But that wasn't his thinking. Despite it being just a few of them, he went ahead and started a rebellion. A revolt that has gone down in history as one of the greatest revolts of all time. And through that small start, with just him and his 5 sons, they were able to conquer and eventually chase out the Syrians from Israel. A tremendous victory started by a man who had very little, who may have thought to himself, I don't have enough. The second example, of course, is when they were able to dedicate the temple and to relight the menorah. Again, Judas and the others around at the time could have said, we can't light this candle, this menorah. We don't have enough oil. We just have a very small amount. So what's the sense of lighting it just for one day and then it's going to go out all over again and we're going to be back to square one? We just don't have enough. But they went ahead. They lit the candle, used the oil that they had, and as the story goes, the oil lasted for 8 days. Now, we're not 100% sure that story is actually accurate. It's being brought down over time through history, but we know it's something that God could do. And so again, people who may have thought, I don't have enough. Now, I want to challenge you, dear friend. You may be thinking, again, I would like to do something, but I don't have enough. I want to use these 2 examples to challenge you, to show you that it is not how much you have, but it is how much God has. And how much does God have? Limitless. God has everything. And because of that, you can do all things. As the Apostle Paul says, we can do all things through Christ, who strengthens us. And so we shouldn't be fearful that we don't have enough and that we can't make a start. and that we can't do what God wants us to do because we're not capable. Friends, it is not what we can do. It is what God can do. It is not what we have. It is what God has. And so, I encourage you. You have enough. And you can start, whatever it is, a ministry you want to do, a service, something you want to do, you have enough. Get started because it is God who will provide. If you are not a Christian, I want to encourage you to trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the one who can give you all that you need to live a victorious life in this world. Trust in Him. The verse that we like to quote at all times, whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And you can be saved and have enough and even more abundantly in your life today by trusting in Him. See you in the next video. We'll talk about Herod the Great. Until then, may God bless you.